Good afternoon, and welcome to today's installment of the 2020 January series. I'm Deborah Hede, a senior from Germany and Turkey, studying international relations and a member of the Presidential Fellows Program. Now, would you please take a moment to silence your cell phones? As you're doing so, I would like to welcome our guests at all of our 60 remote viewing locations, including Denver, Colorado, Fremont, Michigan, South Windsor, Connecticut, and Klaipėda, Lithuania. We are so grateful that you're viewing us today. And now would you please join me as I open with a word of prayer. Dear Father, thank you for giving us this opportunity to freely gather here today. But we also want to acknowledge the privilege and joy of being a part of a greater global community, which transcends ethnic, cultural, and racial lines beyond our borders and points towards your beauty. We are especially grateful for our guest, Dr. Bob Fu, and the work he is doing. As we hear from him today, open our hearts and minds. Let us be informed and challenged, protect us from our ignorance and apathy, and move us to action. We also pray that you comfort those who are deeply hurting and grieving today in our community and beyond. In the name of Jesus, amen. And now, Dr. John Whitfleet, Director of the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, will introduce our guest.
Today, with aching longing for the end of religious persecution of all kinds, it is a privilege for us to welcome activist and advocate Dr. Bob Fu. In 1989, Dr. Fu was a student leader during Tiananmen Square demonstrations for freedom and democracy. So hard to believe, a full decade before so many of our current students were born. Later, while serving as an English teacher to Communist Party officials, he and his wife Heidi were imprisoned for illegal evangelism while serving as a house church leader in Beijing. In 1997, he fled to the United States as a religious refugee, and in 2002, he founded ChinaAid to promote religious freedom and the rule of law in China. Since then, Dr. Fu has testified before congressional committees, briefed State Department officials, participated in a Nobel Prize ceremony that honored a fellow Chinese dissident, completed a seminary degree, earned a PhD in the field of religious freedom with a dissertation on inclusive pluralism with footnotes by Abraham Kuyper, edited an academic journal focused on religious freedom, and served as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's a story compellingly narrated in his memoir entitled God's Double Agent, the True Story of a Chinese Christian's Fight for Freedom. We are grateful to Bruce and Mary Akama for underwriting today's presentation. Please welcome Dr. Bob Fu.
Thank you, Don. Good afternoon, Calvin. Well, we should say Calvin. I'm so honored to be here with you all. I immigrated to West Texas already. You can tell some Texan accent. It's really a pleasure to be back with old friends and making new friends. As John just mentioned, about kind of 30 years ago, when I was there camping at the Tiananmen Square, at that time I was not a Christian, but as a kind of a humanist desiring and campaigning for freedom and democracy. What a sea change. Some of the things that have not changed, especially last year, the whole world had been, watching what's unfolding in Hong Kong, right? many people were concerned and even asked me, is there another Tiananmen Square? And it could be another massacre to be repeated. 30 years later, I was just in Taiwan 3 days ago, actually, observing as part of the U.S. delegation the historic presidential election in Taiwan. And there I was privileged by meeting with a group of 30, the district council members from Hong Kong, and along with the really hundreds of others, citizens and students. It's really both heartbreaking and encouraging to hear their stories of their fight for freedom, for true democracy. Up until now, I was told at least 7,000 of the Hong Kongers, the peaceful protesters, were arrested. The youngest one is 12 years old. The oldest one is 82 years old. And yet, we have seen the encouraging resilience, the encouragement, the inspiration. Those millions of Hong Kongers still showed up and stand up. And even in the midst of the brutal crackdown and unmeasurable brutality and bloody crackdown, and seeing those Hong Kong City Council members, the newly elected, in the midst of this really iron grip by Zheng Nanhai in Beijing, and the democratic forces, they took over 16 out of 17 districts, won a landslide victory. In the latest election, of course, we have seen what happened in Taiwan. Over 8.1 million voters kind of voted in favor of the Democratic President Tsai Ing-wen's ticket. So that's another sign. Actually, we see what's happening between the Beijing's desire and what's happening to the citizens on this oppressed area. But today, one day after the International Religious Freedom Day, it was yesterday, I'm so thankful that we're coming back to discuss about what's happening on religious freedom in China now. Perhaps the most vivid photo that can show what happened in terms of a church-state relationship in the past few years is this one. One in the man on the right side was happening almost all over China in the government-sanctioned churches today. You saw when the congregants showed up, they watched. All of a sudden, there is a flag, national flag on one side. On the other side, there are two portraits were installed. One is Chairman Mao Zedong. One is Chairman Xi Jinping. Of course, ever since he took power and after he successfully removed the term limits of the presidency, which essentially indicating he's there as president for life. Hopefully he can live as long as he could. But ironically, you have a little paper, cross on both, sitting in the middle. That tells what the Caesar, what the emperor, or we can call empressy now, empressy really wants. The only thing, I think some of the house church, official church leaders took a second look and examined and found, that actually picture is very biblical. When was the last time on both sides of the cross there are two men were being put there, right? That was not, of course, the original intention, I guess, by the Religious Affairs Bureau officials, by the zealot, militant atheistic officials. The Caesar officially wants to be worshipped, wants to take over what belongs to God in the pulpit. The closest symbol that I can find to compare in history was the picture on the left in the Lutheran Church in 1933 when Hitler took power in Nazi Germany. That was the closest one. When that time, you can tell what had happened. And when the congregation started to worship, the first line of item was all even listed on the program as part of the official program of worship, is to all the congregants were mandated to rise up and sing the Communist national anthem before the kind of any worship song is allowed. And then after the pastor preached first part of the sermon, and there was listed another second part of the sermon, a speaker called comrade somebody of the local Communist Party committee in order to filter or detox of the previous part sermon one by the pastor. So that has been happening since February the 1st, 2018. Of course, the persecution or the Caesar's attempt or demand to be God did not end in the house of worship, in the Protestant or Catholic churches. It extended to the mosques, to the Buddhist temples. And the persecution, I would argue, actually, in the largest scale, actually happened in the predominantly Muslim areas in West China called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. According to the Pentagon's estimate, between 1 to 2.5 million, 1 to 2.5 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, predominantly Uyghurs, were put in the concentration camp in the past 3 years or so. This is just one of the photos. And the Chinese Communist Party called them as vocational training camps. Except the trainee includes the former president of Xinjiang University, a PhD graduate from a German university, a president of Xinjiang Medical University. I don't know whether they need further vocational training in these camps. These are the internment camps where no freedom of practicing their faith at all. And to make things worse, all of them were forced to even eat porks. For a Muslim, you know what that meant to you. And there were children camps to these Uyghurs. The Uyghur, we call their minority, with about 15 million predominantly residing in Xinjiang. And many of their children, when their parents were taken to the concentration camp, were put in the children camps, where they were forced to be brainwashed by singing the praise songs of President Xi Jinping, the Communist Party, and forced to learn Mandarin Chinese, and of course, forced to practice those traditions that against their own faith. And you can tell, this is one of the conference where some of these exiled family members holding a picture of their missing family members. I know many of them. Many of those were my good friends for religious freedom. So this is the 21st century concentration camps. And how can, in the 21st century, we still see this? Of course, this is the most vivid demonstration of the so-called, as a result of so-called Sinification. So I just use that word. The Sinification actually is Nazification. Sinification is a euphemism that shows how the Communist Party tried to use the faith to be indoctrinated by the communist ideology. Since Emperor Xi took power, he launched, I called, at least 3 major wars against human rights and religious freedom. I will touch on two of them today. One is he launched a war against the faith, against the cross, against the church. It's a real religious war against the faith. Secondly, he launched a war against the children's religious education. War against the faith. Since February the 1st, when President Xi reenacted the new regulation on religious affairs in 2018, that same day, over 10,000 churches in one province alone, Henan province, were banned. And later on, hundreds, perhaps thousands of churches, including many government-sanctioned, we called 3-self patriotic movement churches, were being targeted and being forced to shut down. And one of the unofficial unregistered house churches that were targeted is called Early Rain Covenant Church, which is the kind of flagship church leading China's kind of Calvinistic movement and building a Presbyterian governing system all over China. The senior pastor and the founder was a close friend of mine, Pastor Wang Yi, along with over 300 of their members. On December the 9th, 2018, they were all arrested. And many of them were tortured. And Pastor Wang Yi himself was a public intellectual. In the around year 200, he was named even as one of the 15 most influential public intellectual or public figure by the Asia Newsweek in 1995, or in 2015, sorry. And then, 2005. In 2006, I invited him to the United States to speak at our conference on religious freedom and rule of law and freedom of speech in Washington, D.C. After that, of course, during that time, the President George W. Bush, became the first sitting president ever inviting and meeting with a group of house church leaders and public intellectuals, including Pastor Wang Yi. And he was so encouraged out of his visit in the United States. He went back and felt the call to be full-time in ministry, so he quit his job as a lecturer, legal lecturer in the University of Chengdu in Sichuan province, and then established the Early Rain Covenant Church. And the church has grown so fast. Of course, the emperor took notice. And then the most severe crackdown again after them in from December 2018. So after a secret trial, right after Christmas, on December 26th of 2019, just last month, where his wife was even not allowed to be there. And on the New Year's Eve, December 30th, Pastor Wang Yi was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment. The first time a house church pastor was charged with so-called inciting the subversion of state power. That's basically a Chinese version of treason, inciting the subversion of state power. Of course, again, it is what he preached became offense to the emperor, Emperor Xi. At least 80 of the members were physically, mentally, tremendously tortured. And some even had developed into a suicidal kind of feature, because many of them, when they were under torture with a video camera recording and forcing them to make false accusation in order to indict and against their own pastor. So pray for them. This is just one of the thousands of churches. Of course, since 2015, there is a campaign against the cross. To those of you who know something about the dynamic in the Chinese church, most of the church who have a building with a cross on the rooftop actually are government-sanctioned, three self-patriotic movement churches. So this is a new feature under President Xi Jinping. All of a sudden, the government-sanctioned church has become a target. Within a few months, actually, over 1,600 crosses were burnt, were demolished, were dynamized, were destroyed, were toppled. In Zhejiang province alone, a province called the China's Jerusalem of China, because of its the intense population and its openness over the years. At least 1,600 recorded crosses were being bulldozed, being forced to demolish. And those pastors, government-sanctioned church leaders, those who refused to take down the cross voluntarily from the rooftop of their church building, were arrested, were incarcerated, detained. Some even were sentenced to 8 to 10 years imprisonment for their defiance. Again, this is all done in the name of Sinification or Sinicization. Sinicization. You can see. Of course, many of the house church leaders, like Pastor Wang Yi, were arrested. According to our own documentation, in 2018 alone, we are still documenting what's happening, the figure in 2019. There are at least over 100,000, persons and times where Christian leaders were detained, incarcerated, arrested in that 1 year alone. One of the pastors is also a close friend of mine, Pastor Zhang Cao, a Chinese American who came to the U.S. to study and then got dedicated full-time to ministry from the early 1990s and married with a Caucasian American missionary wife and with 2 children. Actually, one of their children, the boy, just recently graduated with his PhD at the University of Michigan. And Pastor Zhang Cao, a true, evangelist, a true patriot, he could have chosen to live a very comfortable life, to fulfill his American dream, like many of the immigrants wanted to have. And instead, he chose not to join the American citizenship so that he can go back to China without needing a visa to continue his ministry. And over the years, he has established a tremendous ministry, including over 500 mini Bible schools he has established, and even had training centers training the house church leaders in their study on Hebrew and Greek languages so that they can, study the Bible with the original language. And then a few years ago, when he went to the Burma-China border area, he saw these hundreds of thousands of this minority called Kachin minority. This group had been persecuted by the Burmese military, and they lost the land. They were all cornered into the high mountain area. So when Pastor Zhang Cao went there and saw, thousands of their children of the Kachin's minority were barefooted and without much clothes, and certainly there's no education. He felt the Macedonian call and started to building schools for them. Within a few years, 16 schools for 2,000 children were established. He called volunteers from the Chinese house church leadership, and some, including his mother, his 80-some years old mother, was one of the volunteers and teaching among these students. And yet, when he returned to China, one day he was arrested. He was charged with a very ridiculous charge called illegal border crossing. Because many of you knew, in the border area, between Burma and China. Sort of a people, because there are so many minority people over in that area, people just basically, walk or took a boat to across the river, just go that way, very casually. And for that, he was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. Basically, the essence of his charge is he was deemed as a criminal for engaging the illegal so-called charitable work. To help the people means, it's a crime for 7 years imprisonment. Of course, how many of you have read or have a copy of Calvin's Institute on Christian Religion? Come on, Calvinist, Calvin University. I think I should write a book, Calvin University versus Calvinism. And then you are an evil cult, according to the court document in the Yunnan province. These Christian leaders, at least 22 of them, were arrested during their trial. In the court paper, the prosecutor accused them as member or leaders of evil cult group. And the evidence the prosecutors presented, including when the police raided their homes, books like Pilgrim's Progress. How many of you have read that? Evil cult. And Calvin's Institute of Christian Religion. These were presented as evil cult literatures. And then they were sentenced to from 4 years to 13 years imprisonment. So already 22 of them were indicted and sentenced. Of course, we all know, because they are lifting up the name of the Lord as the only name. When they pronounce, "My God is the only living God for my household, for my church," that's offense. That is offense to the emperor. That is offense to the Caesar. You have the churches were forced to install face recognition cameras. The police is in charge of the offering box. And even among ourselves, in our midst today, we have one of another, they call Living Stone Church in Guizhou, which was the largest house church in the capital city of Guizhou province. And all their pastors were arrested, and the senior pastor was even sentenced to 2.5 years imprisonment. I'm so glad that it is friends in your midst who adopted the pastor's son. Enoch actually is in our midst. Can you stand up and we can recognize you? So this is the pastor's son. Yeah. Thank you, Enoch. And that is happening when the churches, the pastors were incarcerated, arrested. So the children, the pastor's children, their wives, they were also implicated. And many of them, very often, even, their wives were taken for imprisonment, for torture. So the second war Caesar or Emperor C launched is the war against the children's religious education. For the first time, really, as a matter of law since the end of Cultural Revolution. China prescribed nobody under 18 years old is even allowed to enter into the church building. And you see, if you understand Chinese, you can tell every government-sanctioned church outside the wall or inside has these posters saying children or non-adults is forbidden to enter into this church. This is a Catholic church. You have seen that is the church deacon or management committee posted that notice. Nobody under 18 is allowed to enter into this church building, or you have to bear your own consequences. And you have 5 forbidden policies in the university, in every school. Students is strictly not allowed to believe in any religion. No religious activities allowed in the school, and no religious organization is allowed at school. No religious symbol, like as small as a cross, is allowed to be worn. So this only happened during the Chairman Mao's brutal Cultural Revolution time. And not only that, for the first time, really, since the end of Cultural Revolution, we have seen at least 2 cities, in Guangzhou city and the Guiyang city, the city passed a regulation basically offering monetary award up to $10,000 for the children, for the students, or for the citizen to report, to betray their parents, or report so-called illegal religious personnel or religious activities. So if you are parents, Christian parents, you better watch out about your children now. And millions of Chinese Christian children were forced to sign a government Communist Party prepared paper to renounce their faith. Millions. They have to, go through rounds of education, re-education, brainwash, and with the threat, basically, to dismiss them from school. And with threat, even their parents or their grandparents may lose the social welfare if they continue to profess their faith. So this is a real new cultural revolution in China. Of course, another war is a war against rule of law. We have seen especially those human rights lawyers were being targeted. So one of the lawyers, along with Pastor Wang Yi in the middle, the lawyer that President Bush embraced was Dr. Li Baiguang, who is perhaps one of China's best constitutional law lawyer and scholar. And after spending a week in Washington, D.C. with me, attending the National Prayer Breakfast 2 years ago, about 10 days later, after he returned, he was found dead at the age of 49 years old in the China's military hospital in Nanjing. Another one of the most prominent human rights lawyer, a Christian lawyer, Gao Zhisheng, who was 2 times a nominee for Nobel Peace Prize. And after suffering tremendous kind of persecution, including the kind of torture, being forced to naked and with toothpicks, I can't even, say too much because of the horrible nature during his torture. He was missing again, being kidnapped already more than 2 years. Nobody knows where lawyer Gao is being held, dead or alive. When I learned about the story in his first forced disappearance, and we have to rescue his wife and 2 children, and out of China to the U.S. And now, the little boy could not really recognize or think about his father anymore. So this is the new wave after President Xi Jinping took power, the new wave of crackdown against the rule of law. More than 300 human rights lawyers, legal activists were rounded up since July 9th, 2017, and then the second wave just started a couple months ago. So there are more lawyers in the past few weeks were rounded up. For what? These are human rights lawyers. Their only job is they want to use the existing Chinese own laws to protect the Chinese own constitutionally guarantees rights, freedoms, including the freedom of religious belief. And yet, many of them are still vanished. That is the war. As one of the leader of the free world, as a country, we cherish religious freedom. What could we do? I think at least we should, pray as the people of faith. I think when I was in the Beijing prison 23 years ago, one of the toughest things for a prisoner of faith was the isolation. Often, when the first 2-3 days, when you were secretly kidnapped or taken to a dark prison interrogation room, round the clock, 24/7, and the first kind of word the interrogator uttered usually is, "We can make you disappear, and we can dig a hole and bury you. Nobody would know." So that's the most fearful thing. But the most comfortable moment came, actually. God used the same group of interrogator one day when the interrogator sarcastically telling me, said, "Oh, Brother Bob, Brother Fu," called me Brother Fu, said, "Many people in the outside world are deeply caring about you." Well, that actually served the most comforting moment throughout my prison time. Because from that time on, I didn't even know my wife was also put in the same prison until later on. But from that time on, I knew I was not alone. I knew, of course, Jesus is with me, God's presence. But, round of interrogation with torture and beating, kind of you feel loneliness, right? As a human, I admit that time was the horrible time, worse than torture. But when I knew my fellow brothers and sisters from the United States to Europe, maybe even South Korea and North Korea Christians, if they knew they are praying for me, they are caring about me, that served the most comfort. So I know the prayers that transform the prison wall. So that's the first item I would urge our fellow friends, brothers and sisters at Calvin and in many other locations. So whenever you're informed, you go to ChinaAid.org or Open Doors or Voice of Martyrs, learn about this. I think just, first item, you can pray in your car, in your classroom, in your workplace, anytime. That's the most powerful weapon. I think we are engaging not a war of blood and flesh. It is first and foremost a spiritual warfare. Of course, we especially here in the United States, we have freedom of speech. As Martin Luther King said, in the end, as victims, as persecuted, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. In the face of the evil, inaction in itself is action. You tell, if you keep quiet, knowing brother, Pastor Wang Yi is serving 9 years imprisonment, knowing actually Enoch's father still has no freedom after 2.5 years torture in prison, and knowing that lawyer Gao is still missing, how could we not speak up and taking actions, writing letters like this? And of course, to the prisoner of conscience, we posted some address. More often than not, the prisoners themselves may not receive it in the first instance, but some of them may get the letters when they were released. And one prisoner actually told me a story. When we launched a letter campaign, within a few months, she received some thousands of letters in her prison. And she didn't know until when she met with her mother in that labor camp, and she said, "What happened, Mom? Many, in the past months, what happened?" The mother said, it's just usual, and many people are praying for you." But she said, she was asked to have several meetings with the prison guards and authorities in the labor camp, and she said, "I was repeatedly asked, how many overseas relatives do you have?" I think we are, as in a sense, these letters show we care, shows we are their overseas relatives. We of course, you have as a citizens, as a voter, we certainly want to hold those public officials accountable, write to our member of Congress and talk to them and let them, take actions to address this, write to our business communities who are engaging the communist leader and doing business. And actually, I think the Chinese Communist Party leader would be listening more on the business leader's voice than the political leaders. And we, of course, go to the White House. We write to our president, speak up in different arenas. So these are the voices that can be heard, and we can make a difference, and at least to kind of lessen the type of torture they could face. So the Caesar is determined to at least be lifted up on the pulpit to be worshipped. And you can see this last photo in one of the Catholic churches. So on one side, it says, "Listen to the word of the party." Actually now, in the latest official document, it's just said so bluntly, "Listen to the President Xi Jinping's thought." And the other one was not shown, is "Walk the path of the Communist Party." To whom should we listen to? In the Jewish tradition, we all know that it's called Shema. The word Shema means listen, actually. That means every Jew kind of repeat this prayer every day in different circumstances. That is the Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. That is called the Shema prayer. The Shema is the form of prayer and determination and the priority of your life and walk. It says, Deuteronomy 6:4, many of you know, said, "O Israel, hear," or listen, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. To whom should we listen? No wonder when a group of religious inspectors went to the one government-sanctioned church last year, inspect the Sinification campaign. During the tour of the church, one of the inspectors took notice that, on the wall, the church has 10 commandments. So the inspector said, President Xi would have issue with this. He pointed to one of the commandments. The next day, 10 commandments became 9. You know which commandment was taken down. It was the first commandment was taken down. Brothers and sisters, as I just mentioned, it is a spiritual warfare. The persecution has reached to the worst level we have not seen since the end of the Cultural Revolution in China. But it's not all bad news. We have confidence, we have hope. We see actually the living Lord God is the sovereign Lord. When the Communist Party took power in China in 1949, after 1.5 centuries of labor of foreign missionaries, including missionaries, from here, there were 1 million Christians left at the time in 1949. And today, after 70 years of Caesar, Chairman Mao, now President Xi, non-stop persecution. Do you know how many Christians are in China? Estimated number. Of course, nobody knows exact. But you want to hear that. I just quote, it's not from my own, it's from a very respected, perhaps the most respected, the religion sociologist on religion in China, Professor Dr. Yang Fenggang from Purdue University. And he organized a group of sociologists and made a very detailed study about the religious growth, not only Christianity, in the past 100 years. And they concluded, today the number of Christians in China has already reached to 116 million. 116 million. From 1 million when Communist Party took power, now it's 116-fold growth. So by the end of the day, we may have to call President Xi or Caesar Xi Jinping as the most faithful servant of the Lord in the opposite sense. So we should be hopeful. We know God is in control. We know even in the midst of persecution or despite persecution, there is hope. There is the Lord's presence. And the projection is by 2030, the number of Chinese Christians will definitely reach to at least 224 million, 2/3 of the U.S. population. And China is destined to become the largest Christianized nation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give the Lord and living God a big round of applause. Yeah. I want to invite Professor. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Salpi from the English department, and we'll take your questions by email or Twitter. I'd like to start by asking what lessons the American church can learn from the Chinese church, which is growing by leaps and bounds in spite of or maybe because of the persecution.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the number one lesson after living in the U.S. for the past 23 years, I think is back to the fundamental element is the Lordship of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the persecution is really not because, whether they worship at home or in a building, whether they are called registered or unregistered, whether they are protected or not protected by officially, or whether they use a King James version of the Bible, or or we have a Geneva version. It's really, at the end of the day, it's the Lordship of Christ. It is the first commandment. I remember one day a group of American businessmen, Christian businessmen, visit a group of Chinese Christian businessmen, and the Chinese Christian businessman was talking about evangelism, share the gospel, share their faith from their workplace to their homes, and the American businessman said, "Oh, you can do that? We can't do that. We will be sued by ACLU." And the answer is, so what? Mm-hmm. I think we were in a postmodern, especially now, time, the American Christians, we were so intimidated by the cultural environment, by hiding our faith, and faith became a kind of privatization, privatized the matter. And I'm glad, at least yesterday during the International Religious Freedom Day, the president made a proclamation for protecting the public prayer. And how can anyone prevent and forbidden our prayers, right? I think that's my first, I feel that's the most important lesson. Live out your faith. If the Lord is, the sovereign Lord is the Lord over all, and He is everywhere, right? We should lift Him up not only in the in the church building, everywhere, Lordship of Christ.
Great. On a smaller, more practical level, how I'm setting you up. You talked about this in class this morning. If the church isn't allowed to admit people under 18, children are not allowed in church. Children are not allowed to receive religious instruction. How is the church making new disciples of children right now in China? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's one of the enemy's scheme is try to cut off our faith from the next generation, from the children. But during the Cultural Revolution, no religious faith is even allowed to exist. How could the faith continues? I think that our faith can be manifested in different format. You can you share your faith. Of course, at your home, it could happen. The religious officials may want to listen to your household, but before that happens, at least you can still share your faith at your household. And now with the dynamic, penetrating social media. And the flip effect could be positive, and we were also using that kind of as a platform. Although China, forbade the Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and so all forbidden in China, and yet there are so many millions of Chinese actually. They use the kind of they called firewall climbing software. Mm-hmm. And kind of registered, they're still able to communicate. Yeah.
A positive use of social media, you noticed.
Yes.
This will be the last question, but it's coming in from several students. How can we find addresses or find ways to write letters to prisoners in China?
Yeah, they're on ChinaAid.org. ChinaAid.org, that's where I established this organization. Yes. You can go to our website and find some of the prisoner address, so you can write a letter with this address. Good. And also another very useful tool that I help Voice of Martyrs, another organization addressing global Christian persecution. They established a website called prisonersalert.com. Prisonersalert.com. Actually, the unique thing was you don't need to even know Chinese, but you can compose a letter in Chinese with the Bible verses and the greeting languages, and within really 2-3 minutes, you can compose a letter to a prisoner in China and mail to this prison to encourage them.
It was so important to hear that it's how crucial it is to know that you are not forgotten. So I would encourage all of us to act on that.
Yeah.
Dr. Fu will be out in the lobby. His book is on sale at the table, but he is happy to greet you too. Have a good weekend. We'll see you Monday. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here.